Welcome to the second podcast on Catholic social teaching, and we're delighted to have Professor Daniel Gallagher with us, and he will introduce himself in a few minutes. But perhaps we could begin with a prayer, perhaps the Ave Maria. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Maria Mater Ecclesiae,
Ora pro nobis.
Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, we're delighted. We have a very talented scholar, Latinist, and also a father and teacher, Professor Daniel Gallagher. Will you say a few words about yourself, Daniel?
Sure, Robert. First of all, thank you for the invitation. Very much looking forward to our discussion and much enjoyed episode 1 of this podcast on social teaching. So my name is Daniel Gallagher. I teach currently at a small liberal arts college that simply offers a master's degree in the humanities. It's called Ralston College in Savannah, Georgia. It's a non-confessional college, but we have a good number of Catholic students, but students of other Christian confessions and non-Christians and atheists and so on. So it's a very exciting place to teach. Prior to that, I taught at Cornell University in the classics department. And basically, my teaching, if I had to, it's been quite varied, the background, but if I had to kind of give it a general qualification, I enjoy, so to speak, preparing students for philosophy and theology. So whether it be through classics or through Latin, history, and so on, as I specialize in philosophy and theology, I was finding more and more that there was, through no fault of their own, insufficient preparation on the part of many young people. And Ralston was a draw for that because I could concentrate on a sort of great books program. We don't call it that, but that would be the best way of understanding it. So I'm married, have 4 children and a 5th on the way. I spend a lot of my time basically in evangelization and catechesis. I think that if I were to think about the ways in which I like to interact with particularly young people and students, whether I'm teaching Homer or Plato or Aristotle or whomever, I think these are all opportunities for evangelization. And certainly the social doctrine of the church is one of the greatest avenues for evangelization, as I think Michael pointed out in episode 1.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And we're really honored to have you here. And really, Catholic social teaching combines, or let us say embraces, both philosophy and theology. So we're very delighted that you're here. And Michael, we have a list of questions. Would you want to begin the questioning, Michael?
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel, for joining us. We really appreciate your time, and it's wonderful to have you with us and good to connect. So we mentioned earlier Pope Leo XIII's 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum as sort of a foundation, as a cornerstone, and what many people consider to be really one of the pivotal moments in Catholic social teaching. So can you talk about some of the key teachings of that encyclical and just give us a better understanding of the contribution that it makes to Catholic social teaching?
Sure, Michael. I would begin by just a brief comment about the historical circumstances around this encyclical, this groundbreaking encyclical, Rerum Novarum of 1891. It's hard for us to imagine, but at that time, it had been well over a century since the church had really approached a topic that had to do, so to speak, with the daily grind and kind of the almost the grime of daily living and working. And it was quite controversial even for that time. And Leo was quite had his mind far into the future and his heart far into the future about the ways in which the church could actually contribute to the discussion of just treatment of workers primarily. So perhaps, and then one thing before I get to just very brief summary of the teaching, here's an image that I find helpful to think about what led to encyclical of this type. So without going into the details of where the story emerged, there was a story at the time, and allegedly it had been heard by Leo XIII. This was a time when there was great industrial progress and production. The means of production were increased to the point that they almost seemed to be larger than man. In other words, that human beings could easily and had become cogs in a wheel of production. So there was one production line, more than one I'm sure, but one in particular, that as there was a social scientist who was observing the behavior of these workers on an assembly line, noticed that even though they were given a very specific task of stamping, basically as almost like towards the end of the production line, stamping a seal upon this drain pipe, that they were not satisfied with just pulling the lever, that the production slowed down, and they figured out it was because that every worker would peek over the top to see what was there. So this is a wonderful image because it shows the human part of production, which cannot be eliminated. And this is applied to, let's say, mass production and so on, all the changes that were taking place at the time. But the difficulty was that Pope Leo saw with this development that the dignity of man and the human person could easily be overlooked and mitigated by this. So what did he teach? Well, the first note that we see pervading this entire encyclical, which is significantly lengthy and comprehensive, was the dignity of workers and work, with the emphasis at this point on the latter, that is the worker, as someone who needed to be valued, cared for spiritually, materially, and so on. There was discussion of fair wages, leaving wide open exactly how that would be determined depending on specific circumstances, safety in the workplace, the ability to form associations was also addressed, because that was a phenomenon that was growing more and more as people were participating together, whether it be in mining or production or whatnot, having very similar interests and similar jobs, that they were taking it upon themselves to actually associate in order to advocate for their own rights and so on, and finding professionals that could help them and all of that. And Pope Leo taught that, in fact, they had the right to do this. There was also, and this is one thing that's actually overlooked, I've noticed with a lot of the more recent discussions I've been following in the media since Leo has taken this, that is, since Cardinal Prevost took the name of Leo, there's a responsibility of both the workers and employers that's addressed in Rerum Novarum. So we often, like when we talk about this 1891 encyclical, we draw attention to the need to provide just wages, again, safe working conditions, structures that would help to support families and so on. But he also has these wonderful paragraphs on the importance of honesty in work, in diligence, so that these were real problems. In other words, a social consciousness on the part of the worker as well, that as humble as the job might seem, it had to be oriented in a specific, conscious way towards promoting the human good, in addition to that individual's spiritual and material development. There are other points of this first encyclical, Rerum Novarum, but really it's hard to emphasize how this created a tradition that we now call the social teaching of the church, to the point where, at least in academic circles, for better or worse, in fact, it's almost a specialty now. And I know that was addressed in episode 1 a bit, of its place, that is social teaching, which maybe we can talk more about later. But honestly, to think that all of a sudden there were these developing ideas that every pope since has touched on, and at least once, if not more time, in a formal way, that is through the promulgation of documents, is really quite astounding. And it's not over yet. So I think I've touched on what I consider to be the main points of Rerum Novarum. And many of these points, if we move on to other documents, they will be developed because once Rerum Novarum was promulgated in 1891, almost everything that follows can't help but refer to it, usually pretty explicitly, at the very minimum through footnotes to the teaching of Leo XIII.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that very detailed but also concise summary of Rerum Novarum. Now, 40 years later, in 1931, Pius XI wrote an encyclical on the 40th year, Quadragesimo Anno, 40 years after Rerum Novarum. How did Pius XI help to develop Catholic social doctrine in this encyclical? And maybe you could say a little bit about the world situation, or the situation in Europe in 1931, which might have influenced this encyclical.
Right, very good. So as you point to, Robert, there are immense developments on the European continent at this time. And if we were to summarize them, it would be with this new kind of, not just in the labor force, but social consciousness, so belonging to nations and so on, that we forget that at the beginning of the 20th century, that Europe is still relatively new to this idea of nationhood and both the rights and responsibilities of nations amongst themselves. And so we start to have the rise of the Nationalist Party in Germany. We have other movements, which are basically, if we had to broadly categorize what's going on, it's this real struggle between the old order, that is through an order that was primarily, whether it be the uniting of, let's say, a church and state, and a new order, which was very much focused on forming one's identity by forming nations, that these two were quite at odds with one another. So Europe was in a critical position, and Pius XI knew this. There was no way he could not know this, and was very concerned about it. So one of the things that we see 40 years after Rerum Novarum that's being emphasized here is that sense of what is the Christian way to come together in a spirit of solidarity? What does it mean to belong? Because even in the early 1930s, 1920s, the church was still divided on this. The hierarchy, the church, yes, but let's just focus on the hierarchy just for a moment. That there were those who were basically convinced that if there was any rapprochement with these more kind of like modern movements, that this would be the end, right, for the church. That modernism was a real threat to, so not just the modernist ideas, which were already at the beginning of the 20th century, of course, we already know, were already being addressed, and very forcefully, by Pascendi and other types of documents and so on. But it's not just that kind of doctrinal sense of modernism, but the modern spirit, which basically saw a certain autonomy to secular realities. How far could Europe go in that way, and the world go in that kind of thing? So in Quadragesimo Anno, we find a few things being developed even further. One of the most significant ones is the idea of subsidiarity. So because of this threat of more nationalist kind of movements, and again, the church was quite prescient in this. It's a topic in itself, but you see, especially in Pius XI and Pius XII, well, even more beyond that, but especially Pius XI and Pius XII, they were really attuned and to focus on one area of one geographical area where the scholarship was developing is Germany, were these Catholic ideas of subsidiarity, meaning that the realities that needed to be handled and would be best be handled by a lower level of governance, ideally self-governance, should not be handled at other levels. So let me give a just very quick anecdote, and it so happens this happened to me today. So I was thinking about this morning, and I was praying, because I was expecting our recycling and refuse provider, which is contracted by the county, to collect our trash and our recycling. We had a broken receptacle. It was cracked and the lid had been taken off, so we needed it replaced. Well, lo and behold, I walk out into the yard because I see this, again, private company, a truck there, and he's taking the can. I knew what he was doing because I made this request. We just got into a conversation. And it was so interesting that he was telling me, why doesn't the city take on this responsibility rather than the county contracting us? And he explained why. He said, I replace so many of these individual receptacles every day, and they have to pay for the gas and my labor or anything. If there were an entity, namely the city, and we live in a city called Pooler, that was aware that all the receptacles needed to be replaced, they would save a ton of money and time, save taxpayers money, and so on. In other words, that this is a decision that should be left to the city, not to the county. Very kind of basic, example, but living in a community, I think all of us could come up with, and having children particularly, start to realize how this is an everyday kind of issue, is who should be responsible for this stuff? Who should be responsible for educating our children? Should it be the federal system, right? Or should it be the local community whose families have the direct interest in the growth, the moral and intellectual growth of their children? So this was a big idea that was developed in Quadragesimo Anno, and interestingly, one which gets developed in later encyclicals, but one, I'll say this about this idea of subsidiarity as well, that Pius XI had that European situation in mind. There's no doubt about it. And we find that that's going to be the case with other encyclicals as well, which I'll touch upon, Populorum Progressio, we think of Latin America and so on. However, what's beautiful about the social teaching of the church is whatever is gleaned from those local situations, the entire world has something to learn from it. I just marvel at this, that the church in its wisdom can be very attuned to local situations, and without in any way mitigating how those are idiosyncratic perhaps to that area, that there are things we can learn for everyone. And I think the principle of subsidiarity is a big one. Another one in Quadragesimo Anno, briefly, is this idea of social justice, which we think is a modern kind of concept. But this started to be developed in the sense of fair wages, distribution of wealth. I should mention that by the time we get to 40 years later to Quadragesimo Anno, that we find that the church is actually struggling with the idea of how specific should we be in these teachings, because these are local matters. And you can see that in between 1891 and 1931, there's still a struggle here, because Leo wanted to speak upon, again, everyday issues, but he was aware that that there had to be local communities of bishops and faithful and government leaders who had to basically come up with a specific, so to speak. So that begins in Quadragesimo Anno. Perhaps last, or two things, which is not absent from Rerum Novarum, the family. Although it's interesting, when you look at this document, it seems to be, there's a certain, so we don't have to get into the specifics of this, but I do want to mention there's a sense of I don't know, I don't have the better word for a historicism for this. In other words, that the role of women in particularly, we can all disagree on and agree on maybe how that's developed since 1931, but it seems to have very much an idea of a very strong idea of a woman's place being in the home and so on. And so it's great reading, I think, for any Catholic, just to see, and so in order to kind of be stimulated to think about these things that may still be developing. The other thing the Quadragesimo Anno, lastly, maybe two things would be the role of the state, which is now after Rerum Novarum, more had to be said about this, specifically with the developments in Europe that we've already alluded to, because the state was taking on more and more, and felt that it needed to. In some of these European states, it felt that it needed to for its own survival on the European continent. Complicated topic, but absolutely crucial for understanding why the state was taken on as a topic and an issue in Quadragesimo Anno. The last thing would be the common good. And this is a very rich one, difficult concept. It seems rather straightforward. It's actually quite difficult. But we see that Pius XI wanted to take this a step further from Rerum Novarum. And one way in which he wanted to do that would be to kind of apply the idea of a common good, to put it quite simply, at the level of the state, so that the state could either violate that so in other words, not just local communities, but at the level of a nation, and that nations could easily violate that conception of the common good by false ideologies. And so this was another salient feature of Quadragesimo Anno, and one which is still being developed today in later encyclicals.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yes, I mean, Pius XI was a great pope. And I mean, just around in those few years, 1930, he has Casti Canubi at the end of the year. And then also 1931, non abbiamo bisogno, fighting fascism or the usurpation of family rights or the rights of the church in education.
Robert, I would just add to that, there's a lot of focus on Pius XII and the difficulties he faced. There would have been really no opportunities for Pius XII had it not been, in my opinion, had it not been for Pius XI, as you say, in those short years to have actually confronted head-on these issues, and what otherwise could have been a pontificate, which would have just been a little blip on the screen, becomes actually a fulcrum in the 20th century, in my opinion, under Pius XI.
Very good, very good. Michael, would you like to continue this beautiful survey?
I love, Daniel, that you mentioned specifically subsidiarity in the context of the common good, because I know that's something that is a lot of times confused. People get confused about those concepts and how they relate to each other. Going a little bit further ahead to St. John the 23rd, he gave us two prominent social encyclicals, Mater et Magistra, which was in 1961, and then Pacem in Terris, or Peace on Earth, which was 1963. And so can you talk about, obviously this is coming up close to the start of the Second Vatican Council. You start having very different changes in society in this time. Can you talk a little bit about what the contributions are that Pope John the 23rd makes?
Yes, thank you, Michael. So with Mater et Magistra, this would be a good one to begin with, because this is another step in that development of the common good. In fact, we have a very succinct definition of the common good, which is still actually considered to be the base definition in the compendium of the social teaching of the church, which we'll maybe touch on later. And basically what John the 23rd teaches is that the common good is the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. Now, in Mater et Magistra, it's not necessarily, I wouldn't call it problematic, but it is it's one of those things where John the 23rd, and this is actually very much in harmony with his personality, he didn't mind putting things out there before they were fully developed or thought through. And some people would say that the very Second Vatican Council is an example of that. But the expression in this definition is the sum total, can easily be misunderstood. And subsequent teaching, we're going to see how there have been refinements of that. But even in Mater et Magistra, there is a misunderstanding in that sum total is a mathematical calculation, which it's not meant to be. And unfortunately, I can't remember the exact the Latin and the Italian, but they don't help much. In other words, that sum total is a good translation. But rather than in terms of mathematics, I think the way we have to think about this is that the human person is already, and Mater Magistra teaches this, already inserted into a sum total. So it's true that the family is that unit, that cell, which must be protected in all ways. But if we work from the bottom up, we find that the family itself integrally exists in a community, in a society, the most basic of which is the church. So in other words, that it's not just these individual families, which we total up. If we take the church, for example, we just put a sum total to that and say, here now we have this local parochial community or the church at large, right? No, families themselves, by the Spirit of Christ, come together in a mysterious sort of community, the body of Christ. And that's more than just this mathematical, right, total of individual family units. So the reason I emphasize this in Mater et Magistra is that I do find, and we may not have time to elaborate this, but I've heard actually and read things even on the web and articles recently that misunderstand this. They basically take everything as subservient to the family, right? Serving the family. Now, it's true that the family both must be protected, and that this is a crucial role of the state to do this, right? But it's not true to say that all of communal life, of social life, is subjected to the family. So it's a subtle kind of thing, but Mater Magistra is already working with this. And in that very definition that's given of the common good, we find that this is something that needs to be fleshed out and continues to be, through the ages. So just a couple of the points about Mater Magistra. Again, the idea of social justice, and it is present in the encyclical itself. We think of this as a modern kind of thing. So I did want to just mention a direct quote from Mater Magistra, where we find in paragraph 39 that all forms of economic enterprise must be governed by the principles of social justice and charity. So there's no doubt that social justice is a term of a principle. Okay, the principle is not really fleshed out in Mater Magistra, but there's no doubt that he's talking about governed by the principles of social justice and charity. That is economic enterprise, meaning policies, even economic policies, whether they be of businesses or of nations. But the important thing I want to point here is what social justice, what it is that the aim of labor, the aim of states, and so on, is in fact to safeguard and to promote justice. And one way of understanding that justice is that it's not simply the individual adjudication of cases, let's say, or grievances that an individual might have in courts of law. But what's interesting about Mater Magistra, it expands this to an ongoing kind of reality. Now, we don't have time to go into it, but in the gospel itself, we find that this is the case. Okay, so diakonosia, this idea of justice, of setting right, the blood of the cross, and so on, that we have this way in which justice is much more than the individual adjudication, right, of cases, but it's the setting right. It's the almost the recapitulation, right, refoundation of something original, something basic, something primordial. And Mater Magistra touches upon this with that idea of social justice. People are uncomfortable with it because it's not very well defined. It's a little bit loose. But I think as if anybody's interested in Catholic social teaching and wants to be a student, I mean, it can't be ignored that there is something there that certainly can be easily be abused and has been abused as an idea. But we can't say that it doesn't have its place in the church. And again, we go back more than 50 years to find that's the case. Should I touch upon Pacem et Terris just briefly, or?
Yes, please.
Okay, so this is John the Third, 23rd, is also a great contribution, and it's a very interesting one because we have another kind of development in the world that we have to take into account here. We're post-war, unlike Quadragesimo Anno, right? We're post-war. There is frenetic activity, basically, especially in the late 40s and 50s and early 60s, of establishing now how do we coexist, right? And we find that the answers to those questions of how do we coexist are actually no longer local, but global. Okay, this is a big step, late 60s. They're global. So I'm not playing politics here, but just to use an example, to have the United States of America be involved, right, in talks and accords, Gibraltar and so on, and Roosevelt, all this stuff, I mean, we're on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, and again, I'm not passing a good or bad judgment on this whole process. It's just a phenomenon that has to be acknowledged, that these initiatives to try to find a way to coexist at the level of nations is now a global enterprise. That's what Pacem et Terris is about. And what's interesting, it's been a touchstone when people quote this document. that in fact, I even see it on bumper stickers of a lot of cars. I'm sure that all of you have as well. Where they quote John the 23rd saying that peace is not merely the absence of war, right? Because in a way, especially on the European continent, they're more than satisfied with thinking that's what peace is, right? That peace is, let's just avoid another conflict like we just had, right? Which caused the lives of millions, right? I mean, throughout the world, millions. And it is, I mean, it just is astounding when we think of the cost of human lives, right, in the 20th century. And just wonder. So, John the 23rd, who had a lot of diplomatic experience, very rich diplomatic experience, more difficult in many ways than many of his predecessors in the shoes of Peter had been involved in. And he knows, in other words, that he knows. He could have been one that would easily say that, okay, here's what to do practically to make sure we don't find ourselves in the situation of a world war again. And he, in his spirituality, is saying, no, it's not simply the absence of war. Okay, so what is it? It's a positive ordering that promotes all that we strive to be the best in, and that we can only strive to be the best in if we recognize ourselves in Jesus Christ. And this would be the next step in Gaudium et Spes 22. But only if we really center ourselves in Christ, right? That we will basically be able to think of peace as something which means truth, an order of charity, liberty, justice, right? That these are not minimal terms in order to make sure that we coexist in a secular world, but these are realities that Christ has now transformed completely in ways that Plato and Aristotle and Socrates could have never imagined. Aristophanes, Sophocles, they never could have imagined. I often emphasize with my students, this is what John the 23rd is aware of, that we can look at these realities now through the eyes of our faith and share those with the world. And that leads to the Second Vatican Council, basically.
Very good. Well, thank you again for St. John the 23rd. And we turn now to Vatican II. And it touches so many areas of the faith, but one, of course, would be the church and the world. And that, of course, would involve Catholic social doctrine. So what would you say are the salient points of Catholic social doctrine in Vatican II? Where would the faithful look to in Vatican II to get a good sense of Catholic social justice?
Very good. And Robert, as you've already mentioned, that key document is Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world. What's interesting when we think about this is, again, just showing the wisdom of the church. People point to this document rightly as something almost unprecedented. But if we were taking a step back further, think of Rerum Novarum. It already is a document which is oriented towards, right, the modern world, the church in the modern world. Prior to that, almost everything that Roman issued, especially in the 19th century, theological, right, doctrinal, as far as these are. It's not that these things are not important. In fact, they're the essence of what we're doing. But it was not basically the case. The church, it really was kind of shy in the 19th century of getting away from these issues, which were obviously connected to the faith, but were speaking to an audience that did not share the Catholic faith. So Gaudium et Spes, that constitution of 1965, is kind of the culmination of what it developed since Rerum Novarum in 1891. That the church now I say it's not uncontroversial. It was known for a long time as Schema 13, because the bishops were in bitter dispute about, one, whether to have such a document, and two, what it would say. And incidentally, two of its craftsmen, one of whom has been declared a saint, John Paul II, another one who I personally think is saintly, that is Benedict XVI, they were key players in this development of Gaudium et Spes, the church in the modern world. So the basic idea that I think all Catholics should take from this is, now there's no turning back. The church directs its message, embraces its mission, and offers words of encouragement, not to simply the Catholic Church, but to the entire world. Right? Now, why can the church do this? Well, the theological way is that, again, linchpin in the document of paragraph 22, right, with which man discovers himself fully in Jesus Christ, right? Beautiful theological idea, which has very concrete implications. So, last thing to say about Gaudium et Spes, and I don't mean to gloss over this because it's such an important document. There's a lot of recapitulation of these ideas that we've already touched upon in Rerum Novarum, Quadragesimo Anno, Pacem, Terris, Magistra, and so on. Pacem, Terris coming later. But in any case, the ideas that basically found fruit in all of these, they are they're kind of, especially those ideas of peace. They're promulgated again in Gaudium et Spes. They're kind of recapitulated, and they're immediately taken up in what follows, which will be Populorum Progressio, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the difference is, if there is a difference, it's now that we have a council of bishops, not just a single pope conferring, speaking magisterially from the throne of Peter, but bishops throughout the world with periti, so experts, some of them lay, some of them from other religions, right, other Christian religions, and so on. And what an exciting thing that now something can come about of that in the form of this constitution of Gaudium et Spes. So yeah, I guess that's there are other points of teaching in Vatican II, namely Dignitatis Humanae, which is absolutely important, but on religious freedom, a human right, which is also very controversial at the time. One that I spent a lot of time on recently because as we approach as our nation now, our 250th year next year, I think it's extremely important to revisit the teaching of Dignitatis Humanae. In any case, that's something that gets developed later on, particularly by John Paul II, in my opinion. And then Nostra Aetate, in a way, also has to do with the social teaching of the church because, to summarize here very briefly, it was a way, by talking about about non-Christian religions, it was another way in which now, if the church is going to immerse herself in a global addressee, so to speak, right, audience, then you couldn't avoid the very topic of how the church relates with non-Christian religions. So I do think that's another important piece of the teaching of Vatican II when it comes to the social teaching of the church.
Excellent. These are, I never heard Nostra Aetate brought in so clearly and so beautifully for Catholic social teaching, and it makes sense. Michael, would you want to take up the next question? Because we've already alluded to it, but it's a highlight.
Yeah, so speaking a little bit more about Populorum Progressio, Paul VI, is very, he was a pope of particularly beloved for many things within the church, many documents that he issued, but specifically in the context of Catholic social doctrine, can you speak to what you think his unique contribution is to its development?
Yes, thank you, Michael. This is a very important document, one which I find to be the most fascinating, and one which in the post-conciliar period, so now we're talking 1967, unfortunately, and I don't like to actually dwell on this because I think it can be distracting, but it has to be acknowledged, unfortunately, is interpreted through the lens of chaos, right, as so much in the late 60s was. I don't simply mean magisterial teaching, but much of what was going on in the church. Personally, I think Populorum Progressio, in my opinion, Montini, Pope Paul VI, that Montini really has an idea of developing the very ideas which we've been discussing all the way through John the 23rd, through Gaudium et Spes. In other words, that it's not a break now, and now we have a new trajectory of Catholic social teaching. In my opinion, this could not be more firmly rooted into what preceded it. So we see this in even the very ideas. One which I have woefully omitted up till now, and that is the problem of unbridled capitalism. Okay, this was already just in Rerum Novarum. I'm sorry that I failed to mention this, but it's extremely important. An easy way to understand this is to say that it doesn't matter what the economic system is. If it does not respect the integrity and the dignity of the human person, particularly the human family, meaning the family unit, on one extreme or the other, then the church has an obligation to speak out. And so the church spoke out from when I say from the beginning, I mean 1891 in Rerum Novarum, against a sense of simply thinking that if you were to take a secular idea of capitalism, that it's entirely compatible in every, if you were to make an outline of it, with Catholic teaching, which is not the case. Okay, so Populorum Progressio actually, that's one thing which Paul VI took on. Now, he took it on in 1967 in an interesting, we talked about this earlier with the European continent. Now the primary, so to speak, influence of why this document was necessary is Latin America and South America. And it's a very fascinating story. But to summarize it, the world was excited about Vatican II. But if you had to say who was most excited, in a lot of ways, it was the bishops of Latin America and South America. Some of them were really a great state of consternation that the council perhaps was too optimistic. That was the case everywhere. But you also had many bishops who finally thought in the teachings of Vatican II that what they were feeling, the kind of the aspirations of in the social conditions of Latin and Social America, were finding voice in the church. Now, what are they? Okay, a few things that we have addressed in Populorum Progressio. One is that there needs to be a proper spiritual care of the human person, and particularly for the poor. So Populorum Progressio, we have this word progressio, which can be a little bit misleading. I don't want to go into too much of the etymology, but let me just mention that we can, in English, we talk about social progress, which is fraught with all kinds of different ideas, but also development. Now, in the Spanish word desarrollo, you have both of those ideas, but the development, if we think of the etymology of that English word, that's closer to the whole idea of desarrollo, unfolding kind of thing. And so Paul VI in this document talks about how it's the responsibility of the church, the spiritual care of the church, that we unfold, so to speak, the full development of the human person, which can be thwarted. And one of the ways in which it was thwarted in a very complicated way, but extremely distinct way, was by colonialism in Latin America and South America. And so we see all of this being a new avenue into which the universal church, and Paul VI begins to address, develop principles and to address the entire world in its social teaching. A couple of more briefly things about Populorum Progressio and specific teaching that I find interesting. There's a development of the sense of rights and duties, which is worth revisiting today, because these are rights which they seem so obvious to us today. You know, we talk about human rights all the time. Well, in that particular situation in Latin America, there was still, in some pockets, there was still a denial that human rights were universally applicable. In other words, that there was a classification, so to speak, of conditions, social conditions, and class, and so on, that you couldn't say that everyone, is accorded the same human dignity. Okay, so that rights and duties I need to emphasize. Lastly, one more thing about Populorum Progressio. There's so much about this that's really important. But already in 1967, we were seeing that there was a misinterpretation of the Christian message and the gospel and the Catholic faith, which continued to be addressed by Cardinal Ratzinger in the 1980s, early 1980s. And this is liberation theology. And I just want to point this out because it's extremely important in understanding even Populorum Progressio's role in all of this. There's so much that could be said here, but I just want to, what's it about? Well, there was a theological issue that became quite dangerous, and it continued in the 70s and early 80s, of the entire gospel message being one in which it was the responsibility of the church collectively and so on to take matter. let's say, social structures to take matters into their own hands to bring about the kingdom of God here on earth. And it went too far. It was, so to speak, I'm going to use the word secularization, meaning looking at the horizon of the message of Jesus and our expectation of what Jesus promised us to this world. And this was a huge problem. And it was already something that was on the radar of Paul VI and something he began to develop, to address in Populorum Progressio.
Very good. Thank you very much. Well, we want to turn to the great St. John Paul II, who really built upon many of these ideas we've already spoken about. And he had three very, very important social encyclicals: Laborum Exercens, 1981, Solicitudo Rei Socialis, 1987, and Centesimus Annus, 1991. I mean, this would be, you could really spend an hour on each, but maybe you could just highlight, maybe even just pick one of these out or two of them.
Sure.
You know, what do you really think John Paul II did in terms of the development of Catholic social doctrine?
Yeah, very good, Robert. And what I'll do is kind of take these three collectively a little bit and just point out some things that emerge, rather than choosing one of the three, but what's going on with these three. The first one, in fact, it's right there, very present, and it's towards the end of Laborum Exercens, is not only a dignity of work, which had been the emphasis in Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno and subsequent teaching, but John Paul II started to develop this spirituality of work. Really wonderful. Now, here's a man who had spent, even as a priest, a lot of times in the quarry, right? And in the mines, with the worker. So he had direct experience. And he wanted to, he didn't just want to, he recognized that there was a spirituality of work, not just a dignity of it. Now, what it is, the key to the spirituality of work is seeing that it is a way for the human person to participate in God's plan to grow in holiness and communion. So we often think of work as, oh, that's what we got to do during the week. How I really get holy is just going to church on Sunday, right? Making sure I go to confession, observing fast days, and so on. And sometimes work is kind of, compartmentalized from the rest of this. And John Paul, starting Laborum Exercens, says, no, by exercising work, we are growing in spirituality. We're growing in our relationship to Jesus of Nazareth, who himself came from a family of workers and himself used his hands to create things. So there's one thing. So the Solicitudo Rei Socialis, we have another historical circumstance we have to briefly mention here. So now we're into 1987. Obviously, he's also, directly aware of the social strife that's going on in Poland and in Eastern Europe and Russia. And we're still dealing with it today, Ukraine, and the former Soviet states. We won't go into that. But in other words, we forget that this is not that long ago. And this really concerned John Paul. And one of the phrases that he used, which still is something that is debated today, is structures of sin. Structures of sin. So briefly, I just want to point out that, first of all, it's present. And that John Paul was quite bold in suggesting that there could be such things, because the principal idea is that sin, right, is in the human heart and deals with individuals. But no, there can be structures. Now, he had in the Stasi and in his experience of communist Russian-occupied Poland, he saw that sin could be structuralized. It's not a word, but right? In other words, choices, moral choices, and so on. You might think you're immune and you can stand up as an individual and resist the system, but pretty soon, right, because we're social animals, that this can work itself into a system. Now, what did he have specifically in mind historically in those circumstances? Well, he was much wiser to not actually give a list of, look at the map, here's where you find them, right? But he does go into the ideologies that would lead to these structures of sin, and they're symptomatic of structures of sin, okay? And most of them come down to, if you had to summarize in one word, what violates the freedom, right, of a human being? Now, it's not freedom to do anything you want, but freedom to come together into communion, right, and to make choices for one's family, informed freedom, right, faith-informed freedom. And that's what he was really about. Lastly, Centesimus Annus, the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, another wonderful document. This gets into more of the technicalities of the free markets, private property. We haven't talked about this, but I would just alert listeners, if you're interested, you can go back to Rerum Novarum and so on and the other documents. But you really have a lot of meat in Centesimus Annus on that type of teaching on the importance of free markets. And you'll be surprised at what you discover, and private property and so on. Things that were already, well, private property, not just alluded to, but actually explicitly taught on by Leo XIII and Rerum Novarum. There's also developments in solidarity and subsidiarity, which are important, and other things as well. But I think that that's probably the best. It doesn't do justice to this incredible pontificate, lengthy, extremely influential pontificate, which we can never forget, but one which had an enormous impact on social teaching.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Well, there's so much here, but we continue to enjoy these insights. Michael, it's your turn.
So, Daniel, thank you for the excellent summary of St. John Paul II. Just really beautiful development of doctrine. Can you talk to us about specifically Pope Benedict XVI, who I agree with you is very saintly and very much in line with the thoughts of Pope St. John Paul II in terms of the way he approached these questions. I almost would say that his pontificate is really a continuation of the same themes that St. John Paul II addressed. Can you talk specifically about Caritas in Veritate, Charity and Truth, which was this beautiful document that was issued in 2009 by Pope Benedict XVI, Cardinal Ratzinger? Can you talk a little bit about the details of that?
Sure, Michael. Yeah, I'd be happy to. And one thing I should say as a word of preface, and only to perhaps, I suppose, alert listeners that I might have a slightly different idea on what Caritas in Veritate was up to, and subsequent social teaching as well, because I had an inside view at this time. I happened to be working for the Holy See and in the Secretary of State for Benedict XVI in 2009 when this was produced, and I was involved in the production of it. And all I want to say, the reason I want to say it as a preface is these projects, and this one in particular, they're almost unwieldy. Too much almost has to be said, and it's very difficult to limit, what should be said. Now, I don't say that in any way as a disparagement of the document, but a way of perhaps the people who are reading it, if they feel a bit disoriented, and wondering if there are some loose ends. Well, having been on the inside now, I used to wonder this sometimes with other types of documents produced by the Holy See. Now I can tell you that there are. That might not be important, except for the fact that people, I think, people need to open their ears. Obviously, the teaching of the Church, but any of these documents, even when they're encyclicals, there's the way that they place in the hierarchy of teaching, and you touched upon that with Dr. Capizzi, I know, so we won't revisit that. But I just want people to keep that in mind. Now, having said that, what were the main concerns that Benedict was really trying to address? One was this idea, a loose idea of charity. Okay, what do I mean by that? That Benedict was ingenious, even before he became Ratzinger, before he became Benedict XVI, in tying the idea of charity to truth, and hence the title of it, which was come up with even before we knew what the encyclical was going to say. So we knew the topic was Caritas in Veritate, charity in truth. So the striving for authentic human development, right? It could not be, so to speak, it would not have teeth if it were pluralistic. Now, it's not to dismiss the fact that you have different ideas out there and so on. But what Benedict wanted to emphasize was that you can even come to a common understanding of the truth, even with people who are non-believers, but you must use that category if you are going to make evaluative judgments on all levels about how to live in charity. Now, having said that, it means that charity is also, we talked about sin with John Paul II, not being a matter of just the individual. Charity is a social reality. It's not just what an individual decides to give some money to a noble cause or something like that. Benedict was ingenious in the ways in which he developed the idea that that charity, the gospel charity that that we read about in the Gospels, it is fundamentally social and tied to truth, and not just individualistic. So that's one big theme. There's a lot that can be said, but that's one thing that has to be pointed out there. The other thing, okay, two other things quickly. Personal conversion. This involves, that is, if in order for his vision in Caritas in Veritate to be realized, Benedict was also very much intent on emphasizing that this is not the implementation of very noble abstract ideas. It's personal conversion. Now, his other encyclicals also emphasize this. Spe Salvi is one that's particularly strong with this message, that it's an encounter with Christ and a conversion, right, which will lead to the realization of the kind of charity at all levels of society that the church has been teaching about and has taught about since Christ. Okay, so what's the flip? What's the flip side to that? The wrong flip side. The wrong flip is to say, here are the principles. I think Dr. Capizzi may have touched on this. Here are the principles. We're going to throw them out there to you, world. If you just keep these in mind as you develop policies, everything's going to be fine. No, that's not enough. So, lastly, there is a allusion, which is going to be developed later, to the environment. This is another thing about Benedict XVI having an inside view. Just want to mention, people think it was Francis, it was all about the environment. Not so. I would like to mention that there's some work now in collecting material to be published posthumously of Benedict XVI on human ecology. And I'm not violating any secret here, I think, at this time, but there was even plans for an encyclical on human ecology. Much of that material was adopted by Francis into Laudato Si. But there's more of it out there that goes on for years. But I just want to mention that people, think about Francis as this, environment pope, and he certainly was. But Benedict was thoroughly concerned about an ecology, a human ecology, which involved care for God's creation, and that's also in Caritas in Veritate.
Thank you very much. If we had time, there was one phrase in Caritas in Veritate that created a bit of a storm because of the translation. I think the Latin was partitio opum, but it was somehow translated as redistribution of goods or something like that. And people thought this was a challenge to capitalism or it was a kind of crypto socialism. Maybe you could, since you have an insider's view, maybe you could talk about that.
Okay, so very good. The it's participatio opum, is that right? I think.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think so. Right. Okay. So one thing, I won't go into the details. People have to realize, yes, Latin is considered the official text. It's not the base text anymore. It's not the base text anymore. When I say base text, the text that we work off, that the translators work off of. The text that translators work off of is the Italian text. Now, there are adjustments made after the Latin is produced. So I can't remember what the Italian is, but it's actually pretty close. It's closer to what the English has than the Latin has. But there is one thing I want to point out here. So this idea of the universal destination of goods, which this participatio is based on, has been in development, particularly since Populorum Progressio. And Benedict took big steps to try to unfold this idea more, the universal destination of goods, as did Francis. Now, redistribution is, as a concept, let alone the difficulties in the translation, but as a concept, is extremely fraught with all kinds of implications. but the core idea is expressed in that Latin. That is that, so we have to look at it this way, that as God's creatures living in creation, that everyone has some participatio, right, in the created order. Because of human dignity, we can't exclude someone and say, you don't have a part, which is what participatio is to have a part in it, right? Now, this is a very good question, Robert, because I think it was limited success in Caritas and Veritate, where Benedict was trying to give a firmer theological foundation for universal distribution of goods. And in doing so, he couldn't avoid the idea of some kind of redistribution, okay? But let's just put it this way, that because I honestly feel inept in this way, because I think there's an answer. I don't think that I've worked it out fully yet. But the idea is, it's not the state's response. This has never been the teaching of the church. It's the state's primary responsibility to redistribute goods, right? It is the state's responsibility to play a role in protecting the universal destination of goods. Yeah. Because at the level of redistribution, the primary redistribution in the gospel, it tells us, who is it? It's we who believe, taking individual moral action to share what we have in our abundance, right? Collectively, socially, but that's the key. And Benedict defended that to the end, right? In other words, that the way in which, if there's any redistribution that takes place, it's through moral choices by moral agents who do essentially exist in community, right? And so not the state. That's about the best I can do. But I'm so glad you brought that up, because there's an idea, a good, perfect example, Robert, of how when that was all said and done, Caritas and Veritate, nobody said, we've got a great definitive word. All this work is now crystal clear. We did the best we could do.
Daniel, I love that you made that distinction with the society, saying, it's the society's role to ensure the universal destination of goods, because so often society and the state get conflated. And of course, we know that then leads towards a lot of the abuses with communism and other evils that particularly St. John Paul II was at pains to warn people against and to point out.
Right.
I was thinking of an anecdote as you were talking that I had heard before, and I think it makes the point that what is really the difference between a religious community and a communist state. They take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They share everything in common. In communism, allegedly, they share everything in common. What's the difference? Well, the difference seems to be very clearly that in a religious community, it's voluntary. People are voluntarily doing this through the exercise of their human free will. In the case where it's coerced by the state, it violates human freedom because it's being imposed as a constraint without, rather than respecting the integrity of the human person. So this distinction that you draw between the state and society is very beautiful. So thank you so much for that. Can you talk about going now into Pope Francis? We have Laudato Si in 2015, which, as you mentioned, was very focused on the environment, and developed a lot of the human ecology arguments that Pope Benedict had very much concerned himself with, as well as Fratelli Tutti in 2020. What contribution do these documents make, and how can they? What ought we to understand by them?
Very good. Yeah, thank you, Michael. So briefly, now I was also involved with Laudato Si, and I remembered it was very, very hard work. It was the hardest project I was ever involved in my time at the Holy See and at the Secretary of State, because the Church had really never kind of embraced this before in a comprehensive way. The important point I think needs to be made about Laudato Si is people think of it as, and this really bothered Francis, and he would even privately make comments about this. If someone would say to him, we love your encyclical on the environment, right? And sometimes he would get quite stern, and he said, it's not about the environment. What is it about? Yes, the environment is included, but he viewed it as a thoroughly theological document, not a policy kind of document. and not one which was to come up with answers to how to solve the problems of climate change, for example. So, as I mentioned, Benedict XVI had actually given a lot of thought to human ecology, and he had shared these ideas with Francis, and it just so happened that Francis said, I've been working, incidentally, and I don't remember the circumstances that led to it, but with some Franciscans particularly, some of whom were really stationed in the Holy Land, who were very interested in the environment and in God's creation, and using a Franciscan lens to develop these ideas of Francis, of giving praise for God's creation, full praise for everything God has created. And in doing so, to, so to speak, this is not feel-good stuff when I say this, but to get in touch with how much was a complete gift. We did nothing, right, to merit the world's resources. And we cannot simply just treat them as if we have full right over them, because we're not the creator. We didn't create them, right? We are the recipient of this gift. That's what he wanted to develop. And he wanted to develop that, Francis, in a way that was theological. In other words, that he was looking for conversion, for people even just to look at the world, right, and marvel at the gift that it was. And if that's all that, Christians did, they would start to treat the world's resources, right? Both the way that they would treat so to speak, the nature, but also other human beings as part of, a part of this great gift. Now, one anecdote that for me summarizes Laudato Si. So, and this is a Benedict idea, but very briefly, I know we're short on time. I remember being in one situation in a group, and someone was really upset that a guest at this person's house a few weeks prior was very upset that there was recycling going into the trash bin, right? And she was furious about this and said something to the family. Now, the family, good Catholic family, they said, how can someone get upset about that, right, when babies are being killed in abortion? Now, that's a good question, in a way. But as shocking as it seems, the ideas that Benedict and Francis develop communion is, you know what? The way that we do think about the recycling bin should have something to do with what we think about human life. And so that's what this document is all up to. And I know it's still controversial, right? And I'm not saying that family had a good point about, a woman who was, happened to be a woman, it doesn't matter, but was upset about, not correctly using, who was pro-choice, but upset about the recycling bin. And the point is that if we are pro-life, we should think about that in that integral context of the world, and we should care about recycling. And as somebody who cares about recycling, all the more so should they care about the protection of human life. So
very good. Yeah, that was the throwaway culture. That was the phrase.
Yes, right.
That he would use and apply to abortion too.
Yes.
And what about Fratelli Tutti? I know we're running short of time. But maybe you could say a few words about this. It's ambitious, isn't it?
Yes. Yes. So this was, in my estimation, I was not personally involved with this. I had retired from working at the Holy See by this time. I was not. I was very interested in it because it was the first major thing that Francis had published since I had been serving on the staff of the Secretary of State. It's a little bit too ambitious, Robert, I believe, is my reading of this. And you could see this happening, again, going all the way back to Caritas and Veritate, right? I mean, I love Benedict, but I could see this happening. It's a question of bureaucracy, involvement, and so on. So it's not so much a doctrinal question, but it's a process question of how these things are produced. There are lots of controversial points about this. The only thing that I'll emphasize is what you've already just mentioned, Robert, is he'd already mentioned it in homilies prior to this, but now he develops this, the throwaway culture, right? Which I think is a wonderful insight. He critiques this, and he was most vociferous about this in several homilies, which were not promulgated in his role. These are daily mass homilies. But he was extremely critical of abortion as the worst, most grievous, abhorrent aspect of a throwaway culture. But he also saw it as integral to the way that we treat creation and so on, which Benedict did as well. The other thing is difficult. We won't get into it now because I think you're having a future episode on this. War and violence, right, and so on. I know you touched upon the just war thing, and I'm sure that will come up in future episodes, but there are some difficult things, which we don't have to go into, but I want to alert listeners that, that if you're uncomfortable, you need to think through these things a little bit more. Fratelli Tutti raises as many questions as it answers with this. There are other things, but I would leave it at that.
Very good, very good. Well, we've gone over time, and we wanted to talk about the Compendium of Social Doctrine and the Catechism, but it seems like what they do is synthesize all that you've already talked about and present it in a type of catechetical or synthetic approach. So, are there any final thoughts you'd like to leave the audience with, Daniel?
Yes, there is.
Magnificent. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Robert. There is something that I'd like to say, especially with regard to the way that all these ideas we've covered over 100 years and more, prior to 1891 and moving on from 1991, that Catholic social teaching, it wasn't invented, right, in the 19th century, that this is gospel rooted. So the other thing I think to say about that, which comes particularly to the surface when you read the Catechism closely and the Compendium, and I'll say just a word at the end about how valuable both of these are. Too many people, I think, that I have discussions with, sometimes who are even good theologians and scholars, they think about the Catholic social teaching, it's about politics from top down. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. I think it's about human life and the human person from the bottom up. Because if we look at it, it's about politics, it's about these issues of how nations get along. It is about all that stuff, right? But if we just leave it at that, this could be totally detached from the gospel message, where Benedict XVI, I think, was the turning point that said, we cannot allow this to happen. These things cannot be detached from the gospel message. And I think one way of looking at that is say, this is about our daily lives from the bottom up. That's what social doctrine is. We are born. One way to think about this, Aristotle famously said in the Politics, is man is by nature a social animal. Man is by nature a social animal. That's a classical pre-Christian insight, right? But it's also very much in tune with the gospel, right? And Aristotle couldn't have imagined the kind of ecclesia that would be possible by the Son of God taking flesh, dying for us, right? And establishing the church. And we have a new way of thinking about man as a social animal. But that's what the social teaching is about, bottom up. Lastly, Compendium. First, it's an underappreciated, underused document. It's not perfect. It's very synthetic. It's also very large. But I used it every day in my prior work. There it is. Yeah, the cover. And I used it every day because for whatever it might be lacking in kind of a synthetic, so to speak, whole, it is comprehensive. Yeah, I think it's commendably comprehensive, meaning that it touches on all the major issues at all levels. If I could, I know we're over time, but I just have to have one example of this would be the Compendium. Is that people, I'm all for discussing Catholic contributions to conflict by relying on just war principles, particularly Augustine. If you were to read the Compendium, you would discover that we have now 150 years of new thinking about peace, and nobody really uses this, in my opinion. I wrote a piece on this, and I got a lot of criticism that I'm not against using just war principles to look at concrete conflicts, right, and how to resolve them. But I don't think it's enough when we have this development, Pacem and Terris and so on, of peace. And so I would just say that the Compendium actually is a tool that helps us with that, and the Catechism as well. They're wonderful tools, both. I would say they should be on everybody's shelf.
Yeah, it's the thing. And we didn't talk, but he didn't write a social encyclical, Pius XII. But if you go to the Compendium and even Gaudium et Spes, he's quoted frequently his radio messages,
right,
and other writings of his that certainly touched upon social doctrine.
That's right. That's right. Yes, and very good, Robert. Very good point. And where's the best place to get it? It's in the synthetic attempt, right, to whatever success it has achieved in that Compendium, because they're there. In fact, you'll see footnotes to the radio addresses of Pius XII, and to homilies actually too. So absolutely, that it's great to read the encyclicals directly. I don't discourage that at all. But particularly if somebody's trying to, if you want to use the compendium and there's an issue, the index is also very good too. Use the index and explore what's there. You don't have to read it from cover to cover. It's probably not the best way to use it, but use that index and you can find some gems in there, including the teaching of Pius XII. Yeah.
Exactly. And we should remind viewers that the compendium is available for free on the Vatican website.
Yes. Yep.
Along with the catechism. So,
Yeah.
I mean, and then you could actually compare different languages,
Absolutely.
which is often very valuable.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I just wanted to say quickly, Daniel, that I really appreciate your emphasis on the this is rooted in the gospel, right? This Catholic social teaching, because I think one of the dangers that we encounter when we're talking about Catholic social teaching is we extrapolate these principles, we try to apply them to the secular world, and we forget that our faith, our religion isn't just principles. It's not just ideas, but it's the person of Christ. It's the full presence of Jesus Christ. And those old wristbands people used to wear, WWJD, what would Jesus do? It's like this is supposed to be a commentary of what does Jesus want us to do.
Yeah.
Very much proceeding from that contemplative union with Christ. And so if we could connect the virtues and the sacraments to these teachings in a more tangible way, I wonder your thoughts on that. Could that help people to understand the Catholic social teaching in a richer way?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And not only that, Michael, you made a very good point. It works both ways. So when I was working at the Secretary of State, sometimes there'd be an intervention, things we would take. They could be, often they would actually be at the European Union, the United Nations, things like this. We would prepare something for the Pope's representative, the observer, to deliver, right? It was amazing that we would then, the phone would ring and we would get letters. And then when they were in town, personal visits from ambassadors who would say, I never heard about this subsidiarity thing. What is this? Can you tell me more about it? In other words, the social doctrine is an avenue towards evangelization, because there's no way that you can actually be interested in this and not discover. In fact, it's people on the outside who discover them more readily, the way in which it's rooted in the gospel. So, Michael, you're exactly right. And I think the proof of what you've just said is that it works in both ways. It's a window upon the gospel, the good news. And I personally know people that open scriptures for the first time, right? I know Muslims who have done this, Jews, because of something that had been said, some principle that had been mentioned in one intervention at one of these unions. So it's a treasure that we have to really not be ashamed of, for one thing, but not only that, but really use as a tool for evangelization.
Amen.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Daniel. I can't thank you enough for your time. You've gone over time. You're very generous. And we would just thank you from the bottom of our hearts, but also thank our Lord Jesus Christ and these teachers of the faith, these popes and the bishops of Vatican II, who have given us this gift. And we God has given us the gift of our common home, but given us the gift of Catholic teaching. And sometimes it's underappreciated. And you've brought out its value to us very much. So we're thankful. Maybe we could just end with glory be to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning,
is now, and never shall be, world without end. Amen.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Robert. Thank you, Michael.
God bless you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. God bless.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.